I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of SPIRASI, and then I'm going to talk about the family therapy department in SPIRASI, and I'm going to really talk from practice, I think, and something around the challenges of working in an Irish context. And I'm going to give examples from practice of how we work systemically. So SPIRASI was founded in 1999, originally to work with asylum seekers in terms of education. But it's provided services to survivors of torture since 2001, and it's survivors of torture and inhumane treatment since 2001. And it's worked with over 4,600 survivors of torture from over 100 different countries. So family therapy is funded by the Asylum Migration Integration Fund, and we have funding from 2017 to 2020. So SPIRASI, it is a holistic approach to rehabilitation. So we work with a team of doctors, we work with a team of therapists, and we work with psychosocial workers. So when when survivors of torture come into SPIRASI, there's an initial assessment with the doctors, with a psychosocial worker, and with the therapeutic staff. So SPIRASI also provide medical legal reports for the asylum process, which is based on the Istanbul Protocol. And it has a role really in education and integration as well, which is key. So I'm going to talk learning from practice. So referrals are made to family therapy as part of the initial, as part of the care plan in the initial assessment. So it's common for referrals to be parents with complex trauma resulting from torture. So parents often present with significant symptomology, and the referral may be for an unaccompanied minor, but we don't get that many accompanied minors at the moment. We're just starting to get more as we go along. So it's usual that children in these families have witnessed violence and experienced violence. So family therapy, I'm really pleased to talk about family therapy because I think family therapy is a really flexible approach. Because we can work with any subsystem within the family. We can work with the whole family, we can work with an individual from a relational perspective, and we can work with a parent and child, and we can work with the couple. So families as we go along have different needs, and we may work with different parts of the family at different parts of time. So also with unaccompanied minors, we can include working with a social worker, working with a key worker, foster parents and significant other. So a systems approach, I suppose, explores the effects of torture in a interpersonal system of the survivors and the family dynamics, and it allows for a broader context of the refugee experience. So the practice is informed by systems, trauma theory, and really a family resilience framework. So my experience is that you can't work with trauma without having a resiliency framework. It's just not helpful. I suppose I have a body-orientated approach as well to working with trauma, and that works very well with different cultures. Middle Eastern cultures actually respond very well to a body-orientated approach. And we use a lot of psychoeducation around trauma, and the idea is that we're resourcing families, we're resourcing individuals to start to understand the triggers in their day-to-day life around trauma and the impacts of trauma. So family therapists also have a psychosocial role. So there's a balance of clinical hours, 10 clinical hours, 5 hours for a psychosocial role. And we work from a position of cultural competence. So we're very aware that our take on what might be helpful may not be how other cultures frame their meaning making. So that's really important. So I draw on many things. I draw on psychoeducation, which is important. We also use in SPIRASI Capacitar, which is an international approach to working with healing using body energy systems. And that is actually based on Peter Levine's work, which talks about how trauma gets stuck in the body during the fight-flight part. So I also use narrative therapy, and we work with interpreters in SPIRASI, and interpreters are a really, really helpful resource. So I see them as a bicultural resource. Not every family needs an interpreter, but they're a big part of the work. I also use play within a family therapy context. I use Santre, and we use expressive arts. So it's a bit like Mina was saying, I suppose parents that we see have a range of post-traumatic stress, symptoms around dissociation, flashbacks, freezing, insomnia, poor sleep, fear of deportation, impaired memory can often be impaired, suicidal thoughts, low mood is quite common. Children of tortured parents. So this I didn't want to go down a trauma discourse, but just to say what I really pick up on in the families that I see is that children present mostly with what I would call parentification, nightmares, concentration difficulties. And when I say parentification, often they feel very responsible for their parents and for the feelings of their parents. And they can be quite quiet, quite withdrawn, but you wouldn't necessarily say this child has a post-traumatic stress disorder, or, you know, they don't often present in that way, although they may do in other contexts. When the parent starts to talk to you, then you start to hear how a child is kicking a wall or punching a wall or doesn't sleep and has constant nightmares. What I would say is common is fears, and fear is in the system of the family. So it's not just the child who has fears, it's the parents, everybody in that system, which kind of mirrors torture if you think about it, that you know, the fear in the community fear. So the other thing I see is I would say more attachment-based behaviours. I don't like to use the word disorder, but there's definitely, when parents are struggling so much, sometimes it's hard to be fully present. And, you know, you can see children who maybe present, but there looks like there could be a beginning of some kind of attachment difficulty. Often you'll get children who almost seem to be misdiagnosed with something like ADHD and attention deficit kind of difficulties, or developmental delays, that kind of thing. So children under 8 years old can present with disorganized behavior. We see this a lot with older children. So whether it's symptoms of trauma become more evident as children get older, I'm not sure, but I see a lot of older children who have depression, suicidal ideation, and self-harm. So one of the things that I see that's missing since I've been working with SPIRASI is a family assessment. There is no family assessment of torture. And I think that assessing the effects of torture on the survivor's family dynamics is an important part of assessment in terms of identifying mental health needs or risks for children. So in terms of family trauma, you have effects of torture of one parent on the other spouse, you have the effect of parental torture on children, and you have sometimes we have a child who has experienced torture and the impact on the parents. So really, I would say that mental health needs of children often aren't identified, and that when they come into SPIRASI, we may be the first point of contact. And sometimes parents are in maybe in psychological services, they might be in contact with community mental health teams, that kind of thing. But sometimes they won't talk about relationships. And when I have parents in, they say, well, I wasn't asked. I didn't think it was important. I feel really guilty now. I should have spoken about my son's nightmares. I should have, So is this about holding, what I found really helpful is around holding a wider lens, wider context, and really around multiple losses, that you're dealing with trauma, but you're also dealing with multiple losses. So loss of home and what that represents. So I always like the Rinas Papadopoulos, who's an English, probably systemically based professor, who talks about the loss of home, and he talks about not so much around post-traumatic stress disorder. He talks about disorientation. How when you lose your home, when that there's this process of disorientation, and I certainly see that's what I see with families that come into me. One of the main stressors, or a big stressor, because I work with a lot of families who are asylum seekers as opposed to refugees, is the asylum system. So we have families who have experienced trauma, but they're also within a traumatizing system, and that exacerbates the trauma that they've experienced. So the asylum system is a big, it can be a big challenge, really. So, and really, when families talk to me, they talk about not being believed, or this implicit or explicit disbelief, and that's the thing that really is very difficult for them. So I think in the family therapy department at SPIRASI, we try to embody the kind of the opposite to the experience of torture or disbelief. We try to provide a safe environment where people feel welcomed, where there's just unconditional regard. So a lot of it does come down to relationship as well. So there's a lot of disillusionment and disappointment, and there can be a lot of factors around prejudice, racism. Direct provision is, it's another system which exacerbates what the asylum seeker has experienced. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about direct provision as regards children as we go along. Also, there are, for asylum seekers, barriers to education and other systems. So, and I'm going to talk about that as well. Here we go. So, this is an example of a sand tray that was done with a family that actually spontaneously kind of worked in this way. So this is a group of siblings who are exploring their relationship with siblings that they had been separated from. And as you can see, you can sort of see the beginning of warlike inventory there. And here we have a chimpanzee with a baby on her back. And that was one of the children's, how she represented her relationship to her younger brother, she had been separated from. And we can see all of the adults here, sort of talking, trying to decide what to do. The children here, and then we have like lots of figures who kind of are sort of discarded or lying around, and there's a sort of beginnings of kind of war-like activity over here. And then I always ask families to name the sand trays after they've done a sand tray. So the children named this was the last time together, this was before separation. And this one here is a young girl who came in, 14-year-old girl, and within the family, so they were busy doing another sand tray, and she reworked this tray the whole time she was there for the session, and she was using kinetic sand. So kinetic sand has kind of got a clay to it, so if you think of kinetic sand, you put it in, but it doesn't stay solid, it just dissolves. So it was like her hope for a house, her hope for home, had no foundation, it would just collapse, and then she'd rework it. So she has created three homes, one there, and one there, for each one of her family members, but they would continually collapse as she made them. So one of the other challenges that I face or I find, and it's really interesting, is around talking. So we have lots of conversations about how we talk. And there's a lot of intercultural negotiations really between talking and silencing, because there is, I suppose, research which goes back to the Holocaust around silencing, around how things get talked about within families. But then, the balance is that there are differences in cultures, really, based on verbal expressiveness. So a lot of non-Western cultures have got different ideas about how to talk, who to talk to, how they talk to children. And then also, another thing that I face a lot is that speaking of events can depend on the nature and type of the event. For example, sexual violence. So often I might be working with a couple, and I might be working sometimes with a parent who's experienced rape, and I'll be working individually. So it's important to negotiate what can and can't be told and to who. So the silencing, so sometimes it's protection of other family members, differences in cultural expression, a conscious strategy to protect children, or sometimes a reflection that the parent just doesn't talk at all. And then it can be an avoidance, to try to avoid the going back into the pain and the terror of the original trauma. And then it can be around adhering to traditions and beliefs. So I'm always balancing, does talking or not talking help? Is it a coping mechanism? Or does it cause distancing and alienation in the family? And does it block a mourning process? So we often have a lot of families who've got what I would call ambiguous loss, where they've been separated from family members and they don't know if that family member or child is alive or dead. And, so really what I'm looking at is how do these issues influence the daily lives of families, but I'm being led by the family. I'm led by the needs of the family. So if the family decide they're not talking about this, it's fine. We try and work in a different way. So here, this is the family. The first session, which I'll actually show you the next. The first session, this is a family who came into me where one child had been tortured. The father had been tortured on 2 separate occasions, and the mother had fled first with her daughter to Ireland. And the daughter was 6 years old when she drew this. So she was about 5 or 4 when she arrived in Ireland. And they said, well, look, we don't talk because, we don't talk about these things. And the daughter, and she knows nothing. She knows nothing of what. But you see in the drawing, she shows the journey, different parts of the journey. And we have these threatening figures. These kind of threatening figures around. And then we have the house with no windows. We have a little door in there. So that family gradually started to begin to talk, but I took it very much on where they were at, where they wanted to go. So it was a very gentle kind of process. We went ahead. So back to Papadopoulos again. So he argues that a variety of responses to trauma could depend on a lot of different factors. So personal history, psychological characteristics, and relational support systems, gender, power position, and meaning, and then hope. And hope is, I think it's a big part of the work in family therapy. So when parents and families feel hopeless or they feel helpless, it's how do you do hope with that family? How, and sometimes part of the role is actually therapeutic witnessing. It's just to witness. Really there's a continuum of complexity, and I think it comes back to resilience, and it comes back to attachments and resources. And families may have experienced hugely traumatic events, but they are very resilient still. And then you may have a family, often it may be a single parent, maybe where there's fewer resources. And when I talk about resources, I'm talking about external and internal resources, I suppose. You might have a family who are a little bit more vulnerable, and they're quite poor attachments. This is what I thought I'd do. I thought I'd try and give a couple of case examples, really just to show the practice of systemic psychotherapy. So I had one family who came in, and they would have had stronger attachments. Their attachments were very strong. The resources were quite poor, but internally they had this incredible resilience, this strength. And they had a very strong attachment with their children, and I actually think that is a protective factor, because it increases the parental sensitivity to the child. So one parent had been tortured, one parent had experienced and witnessed the violence, and all of the children had experienced and witnessed violence, and the family had been in hiding prior to forced migration. The grandfather had been murdered, so there was intergenerational or transgenerational transmission of trauma. So the different sessions, so we began by exploring communication. So the family came in and they said, how do we talk? So they had two questions, how do we talk? And the other question was, how do we make them forget? Now they came in as a family of 7. So it's like, which one are we going for? How do we talk? The reason why they had come in was that the youngest child became very distressed, and they would literally try to rearrange the furniture in direct provision to make her feel more at home. And she constantly talked about home. And they didn't want her to talk about home. They wanted to make her forget. But she kept on reminding them. So it was almost as if she was a memory for the family. Her twin just talked about feeling squashed and having this weight on him and feeling squashed. And he was sort of showing difficulties kind of focusing, those kind of things. The next child, she was a storyteller, and she talked about a rat in the house, and how Mummy and Daddy had saved them from this rat in the house. And the next child, a young teenager, talked about how he just felt so sad. So all he did was he slept. So he slept constantly to try to avoid feelings of sadness. And the next child, the eldest child, who had been kidnapped, and he would have been older, I suppose he would have had a different kind of understanding of what was happening for the family, talked about how he didn't want to talk because he didn't want the family to feel blamed. And so he didn't want them to feel blame. And what he said was, all I want is an address. I just want an address. That was... So there was actually permission within the family to begin talking. And gradually, the youngest child, that they didn't have to rearrange the furniture for her anymore. She was given the permission to be able to talk. One of the sessions dealt with psychoeducation around trauma, around implicit body memories, feeling memories that can come into the present. So this involved the eldest child who had a period of a year. He wasn't able to go on a football trip. He was a very talented footballer, but he didn't have a passport. And he became very, very depressed, and he became hopeless. And he was actually experiencing a lot of suicidal ideation at that time. And he talked about how he'd wake up and he'd feel hopeless. He would just feel hopeless. And, and we sort of look, what's happening in the body, and he'd say, I'm always lying in a particular position. And then he said, well, you know what? Well, when I was in hiding, I was always in that position. So we're able to talk about feeling memories, implicit memories that come back from the past and then impact in the present. So we did a lot of psychoeducation around trauma and how trauma can impact and how the past can come into the present. A couple of sessions were with the parents as a couple, and they wanted to talk about how could they talk to their children about the father's symptoms of PTSD. And the father had been locking himself in the room when the children left for school crying. And he just, he felt ashamed, he felt like he hadn't protected his children. And then when they came home, he would come out the room and he would pretend that everything was okay. So he was living, there was a part of him that the part of him that was trying to cope, the part of him that was really, really struggling. So we talked about modulated disclosure, about what's appropriate at what developmental stage for the child, what were the children noticing, that kind of thing. We also looked at the exploration around the relational impact of trauma on the couple's relationship. And the father he was very, had a lot of avoidance kind of symptoms. And so when he felt like he'd become quite hyper aroused, and he would try to deal with that by walking. And he would walk, but the problem was he would just leave the family and he would just walk. And his wife was saying, well, he's gone to Tesco, but I don't know. And her understanding was, I'm in the way, I'm holding you back, you don't want to be with us. But also her trauma then was triggered because she had experienced a lot of trauma as well, and around safety. So she'd become highly anxious. So safety and trauma is another thing in direct provision. So around safety and trauma, it's a big thing. I get this a lot when families come in. They feel often quite unsafe. So if there's conflict in direct provision, conflict between families, conflict between that can trigger symptoms of trauma from the past. So safety is key. Feeling safe is key, and the family talked a lot about that, about not feeling safe. And then this piece here, resilience and adversity activated development. So this, with the eldest child, for example, he talked a lot about identity and loss of identity, and what happens when you're suddenly, transitioned to a new country, and how he felt like he was just seen as this asylum seeker, and he was seen in this kind of very narrow kind of way, which was nothing really to do with him. So we talked a lot about identity and around alternative stories to the dominant discourse around refugees and the experience of refugees. And he talked about how he had grown from his experiences, and he said, I have social conscience, I recognize difference, I recognize diversity, I have empathy, and I have compassion. And the other thing that I haven't put in there is that I'm often asked to write therapy reports for the asylum process. And when that happens, I'm actually kind of constructing the reports with the family. I bring it back to the family. I say, what do you think is important that goes in here? What should we, and I really try to give the children a voice, because the children do not have a voice. And so I try to reflect the children's experience in the reports with the family. And that can be a really, really important piece of work, because the family's experience is witnessed. It's almost as if I'm an outside witness, and it's almost a testimony. So we did a lot of work around that. So this is where the family are at now. So this is the future home. You see, they're still kind of a little bit in a transition stage, but they're looking at how to create a bridge to their future home. They're almost sort of kind of looking back at their past home. This here is, they drew on their faith. That was a big thing, which actually helped them be strong enough to survive what they survived. So it's almost like a rite of passage, a transition from direct provision to the future. And that's the family I've worked with for over a year and a half. Do we have time for this? Where am I? We do, okay. So the second case is a parent who is experiencing more symptoms of trauma and more vulnerable, I think, really. And she has one child. She experienced torture and she witnessed violence. There was intergenerational trauma, and she's been separated from her older son and her husband. And this is really the piece that re-traumatizes this woman is this loss. She can't grieve. She doesn't know if they're alive. She doesn't know where they are. So really, here it's the beginnings of starting to work with the child and the parent, because the referral, the parent said, "I really want you to see my child because he's frightened of me." So she looks at her child and she sees fear, and the child looks at her and he sees fear. And so it's in the family system, there's just this fear and terror. And so when they have nightmares together. That's how kind of combined the trauma is. And this child had been kidnapped with the parent, and he had witnessed what had happened to his parent. This had not been picked up by anyone, I think, even though this parent had been in individual counselling. And this child, you wouldn't necessarily think presented as if he was distressed in any way. Certainly you wouldn't have a school picking up that this child was very distressed. He presented with what I would call the parentification. He was attuned to his mother. He read her every non-verbal expression, what can be said, what can't be said. How I'd like to work with this is I'd like to work with another therapist, but I don't, there's not that many resources sometimes, but so a way around this sometimes is to use a family play therapy approach. So I have alternate individual sessions with the parent to try and help her on stabilisation and safety of some of the symptoms of trauma, because she's dissociating for hours at a time. And obviously there's an impact for the child because of that. And what he does, he tells me when she does that, he taps her on the hand and he says, "Come back." So I'll work with the parent one session, and then I will do a joint session with the parent, with the child in the room. And I incorporate play. So what we do is, and I would have spoken to the parent about how we work in this way to make sure that it stays safe for the child. So we have a talk time. What's one thing that's going well? Now, the first time I said that was a little bit tricky because they had difficulty finding one thing, or one thing the parent thought was going well, the child didn't think that was going well. But that's the beauty of the approach, because the parent got to see the child's experience and witness the child's experience. So really, we've been exploring emotional expression. And I think it came as a shock to the parent to realise that her child reads the non-verbal and knows that she's distressed. And then, so we had a conversation around being sad. So, and the child, and the mum said, "Oh, I just have a headache. That's all that's wrong with me." And she was dissociating, and the child's looking at her. And I said, "Oh, I wonder if Mummy is feeling a bit sad." And she said, "Yes, I'm feeling sad." And I said, "And who else feels sad sometimes?" And the little fella said, "I feel sad." And so that there's that kind of, the parent is seeing the child is seeing the parent, and it's around enabling the child's experience to be witnessed in a safe way. So I often work with children. I kind of use metaphors. I try to keep it in metaphor, and it doesn't allow the full reality of the trauma to kind of intrude. It's a bit of a safer way to work. So this is this child's nightmare. So he has the lion, the snakes, so the very frightening aggressive, the dragon. And then here we have the tiger, and the tiger has an outstretched paw, and you might find it difficult to see here, but this is how the child represented himself here. And the paw is actually touching the child. And he brought in his mother here. This is my mum. And he was physically frightened by doing the sound trade. So we kind of went, what's happening? My heart's going, and when your heart goes, what helps? So we kind of then, that's when I bring in a bit of body work. So I sort of said to him, can you bring in anybody else to help? Can you bring in any other? Who could come in to help? So he brought in a monkey. So this is the beginning of the exploration of his relationship with his brother, who he's been separated from, who we don't know is alive or dead. So I suppose my learnings from practice are the importance of relationship. Safety and stabilization are very important when you're working with people who are traumatized. And really a principle is embodying the opposite to torture. So focusing on mutual respect, engagement, embodiment in the environment. So it's a welcoming environment when people come into SPIRASI. So even though physical action and doing can be limited in the asylum process, human relationship is the one thing that sustains and gives people resilience. So there's a lot of work around making precious. Well, what is the one thing that has allowed that family to survive? What do they value? And that can counter the helplessness and the despair. So, and really I'd say I have a flexible approach. Systemic psychotherapy is very flexible. It is quite messy sometimes. I'm not sure if one intervention fits all. In terms of children in the context of Ireland, there's a need for a family vulnerability assessment to identify families and children's mental health needs. There's a need for an integrated multi-systemic approach in terms of how we link into community mental health teams, early years, and education and other agencies. Often I feel like we're kind of holding trying to join the dots up in SPIRASI, and I spend a lot of time trying to access services, not even sure if a family's been seen by a service, or in fact, how to navigate that system. So if I can't navigate a system, I don't know how people, families from the asylum process can. And the big thing that I'd like to say about direct provision, I see the fact that direct provision is isolated, it's away from community, it's away, there's a huge impact on children in terms of being able to access community and recreational resources. Whereas with families who aren't involved in social services in Ireland, you might be able to do a mehel, something like that. That doesn't apply to families who are asylum seeking or refugees, because family functioning is not the issue. It's the barriers to access to resources, to education. So that's a huge issue, and the problem is because of the distance, so even school-based supports, the transport leaves at a particularly time to go to direct provision. So these children leave, they can't access many of the extracurricular resources depending on which direct provision they're in. And I'd say that I think there needs to be culturally congruent forms of therapy. So I think so. It is a bit about innovation. It's looking at what works. Maybe with unaccompanied minors, we're starting to get more in. Maybe they might work better in a group setting. And really, I suppose practice can inform theory, and maybe we're not at the stage where we're evaluating a lot of our work, but yeah, so, sorry. Thank you.